My name is Philip Hain. I am the Executive Vice President of Temple Sinai of Glendale, and I would love to welcome all of you here this afternoon. We've got a great program, and I'm very excited. For those of you who don't know, Temple Sinai of Glendale has been in the community for 95 years, and in this building for about 69 years. And where we're sitting was the original sanctuary before that sanctuary was built. I want to start by thanking the Federation, the Jewish Federation, for allowing us to host this event. It's, I think, the second year we've done it here at Temple Sinai with the One Community, One Story. And so we're very grateful for the Federation for allowing us to host this event. The business that everybody always wants to know is, where are the restrooms? And so there's a sign right there. You go through the double doors and to the left, and they're very easy to find. Many people at Temple Sinai were instrumental in putting all of the goodies and the whole program together. So I want to specifically thank Ruth Devine, Susan Hain, Flo Cohen, Ruth Goldstein, Sally Davis, and Jacob Barr. They were the ones who kind of put everything together. It's a nice coincidence that this being a literary event and Temple Sinai is in the midst of revamping our library right here. So there's lots of books on the cart and in the boxes on the ground. So please feel free to take a book. These are books that are overstocked and we're trying to get rid of. So help yourself to more than one. Last is, I read the book. I'm very excited to hear the author's story, but to tell you more about that, I want to introduce Denise Schaefer from the Federation.
Thank you, and welcome everyone in person, and to those of you joining us via Zoom, welcome as well. A special thank you to the Sisterhood and all the staff at Glendale. I don't know if you noticed, but they've gone above and beyond. We have some Cuban food and desserts from local Portos, so it's perfect for our theme today. My name's Denise Schaefer. I'm the moderator of this event and co-chair along with Debbie Noble. Before we start, I'd like to, gosh, I don't know if it's sounding, I keep hearing it's okay. Okay, I'd like to have a few acknowledgements. It takes a lot of effort to put on a festival like this. So let me send a few words of thank you for the Book Festival Committee. They're in the back putting all of our books together. This is our ninth out of 10 events. So be sure and look at some of the books that we've sold already. Rebecca Russell as our Federation staff coordinator. Thank you as well. Also on your table, we have a book guide, community book guide. This is the first year that we looked at some ways to enhance our one book, one community event. And I want to especially acknowledge Shelley over there, who did a lot of research into the story of Cuban Jews in the late 1950s, of which you will hear quite a bit more today from our author. I'd also like to thank our behind-the-scenes tech wizard, Jake Tavel from New York, who is coordinating our Zoom, and our Literary Circle members. Many of you are here today. We thank you all for your financial support, of which makes this book festival possible. One last thing, this year, in addition to the 25th anniversary of the book festival, is also the 30th anniversary of our Jewish Federation. 30 years of bringing our Jewish community together with programs such as summer camp, cultural arts, PJ Library, and most importantly, serving our Jewish community as our voice, especially with times like today. So look for some special programs throughout the year, starting with our 30th anniversary celebration brunch in June. All right, let's get started. let me take a few minutes and introduce our author. AJ Sidransky, and we can call you Alan, right? Alan. Alan writes about ordinary people faced with extraordinary situations and events. His latest book, his fifth novel that he'll be talking about today, is based on a true story. It transports our readers back to 1958 Cuba, where we meet two Jewish brothers on different sides of Castro's revolution. His work includes Forgiving Maximo Rothman, Forgiving Stephen Redmond, Forgiving Mariela Camacho, and The Interpreter, which was shortlisted for Best Historical Fiction from Next Generation Indie Books in 2020, which he wrote during COVID, as we learned. His family emigrated to the Dominican Republic after the Holocaust, where he currently goes to every summer and is working on his next book, which he'll tell us a little bit more. So let me bring Alan up, and thank you for joining us from New York and to tell us about your book.
Thank you so much for your introduction. And yes, live from New York, it's Sunday afternoon. So let's, you know what, Denise, you take this one. And when I need it,
And then you'll let me.
So, first of all, thank you all for coming this afternoon. It's a pleasure to see you all. I might invite whoever would like to come sit in the center so we're not maybe so spread out. I'm going to talk a little bit about me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and talk to you a little bit about Cuba and Cuban Jews, and then we'll open it up to questions. So I like to start off with a little story, and I have a little LA story for you. So when I was in the third grade, first I'll ask a question. Are there any teachers here or former teachers? Could you raise your hands? Okay, so plenty, as usual, because teachers read books. So I should start off by saying that everyone has at least one teacher that they remember because that teacher changed their life. So Mrs. Zimmett changed my life. And when I was in the third grade, we came back from some winter vacation, and Mrs. Zimmett asked for us to talk about our vacations. Are there any ex-New Yorkers here? Okay, do you remember how you sat in rows in alphabetical order? Okay, so I'm sitting all the way in the back because my last name starts with an S. And, the kids start getting up, and these people went to Florida, someone else, went skiing, somebody went to Denmark. They all had great vacations. I went to my grandparents for 4 days. I was embarrassed to say this. So when they got to me, I told them about my trip to Disneyland, which was my dream. And then 2 weeks later, my mother went to a PTA meeting, and Mrs. Zimmett said, "Harriet, how was your trip to Los Angeles?" And my mother said, "Excuse me? What trip to Los Angeles?" Now, to my parents' credit, they did not punish me, but that was an early sign that I was a natural storyteller. So now I'm going to tell you a story. So the question is, all right, incident at San Miguel. How did this story come to me? When I wrote my debut novel, which was titled Forgiving Maximo Rothman, which was about the experience of one of my great uncles who escaped from Nazi Europe to the Dominican Republic to a place called Sosua, my wife said to me, you should submit this to the Jewish Book Council for a review. So, of course, I did. And the Jewish Book Council, they gave the book to a reviewer named Miriam Bradman Abrahams. And she loved the book and wrote me a tremendous review. And as it turns out, we had a friend in common, and this friend arranged for the two of us to meet over lunch, which we did, and we became, sort of good acquaintances. Over the years, we were in touch. She reviewed a couple of my other books, and just before, it was the spring before the pandemic, so it was sort of May or June of 2019. She contacted me and she said to me, over the years, I have been collecting files and interviews because she was born in Cuba in 1960. And she fled with her parents in 1962. And she said, I'd like to write a book about my family's experiences, and I don't really know how to write a book, and maybe you could look over my stuff and you can give me some ideas, on how to go about doing this. So I said, of course, I'm happy to look at it. And she sent it to me, and 85 pages later, I said to her, look, what is it you want to do here? And she says, I want to write a memoir. Truth is that this material really wasn't for a memoir. It was either a family history or it was great material for a novel. And I told her that. So I said, I could take some of this and use it in a novel because as I was introduced, I like to write a story about ordinary people faced with extraordinary events. And the Bradman brothers, their real names being Juan and Solomon, and their wives were faced with extraordinary events. So I said to her, how would you and your parents, who were still alive then, father passed away on Yom Kippur this past September, I said, how would you feel about me using this material in a novel? And, she said, I don't know, I'll ask my folks. And they invited me down to Brooklyn. And I went, took the subway out to Brooklyn, and I fell in love with them. And I think they fell in love with me too. So they started telling me about their experiences. And, it was a really kind of a weird thing because, I was looking at them and they were my parents' contemporaries. Now, my parents were born in the Bronx and they were born in Havana, but they reminded me of my parents by the stories that they were telling me. And so they came from the same time. And it was a really, really interesting experience for me. And I started talking to them and asking them questions to fill out the story that I had read that, she had in her various notes. And when I got to the part about Juan meeting Che Guevara, that's when I knew I had a book. So let me talk to you a little bit more, though, about Cuban Jewry and the circumstances and how this all came about. So Jewish presence in Cuba goes back as far as the 16th century, when you had converso Jews who left Spain after the Inquisition. Most of them initially went to the Canary Islands, and there was a movement of these Jews. As the Inquisition followed them to the Canaries, there was a movement of Jews into the New World. Cuba, what became Puerto Rico, what became, Hispaniola, which became the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and also Mexico. And eventually, the Inquisition followed them there as well. And also into what they used to call the Spanish Main, which is Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela. That community never really came out of the shadows. But sometime around the very end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, there was movement of Jews. There was a movement of Jews all over the world You had Jews who started to come to Cuba. So in Cuba, at that period, you basically had three communities. You had Sephardi Jews who came from what was then the Ottoman Empire, most of them coming from Syria, because that's where a lot of Jews lived. You had American Jews who, Eastern European Jews who had already come to the United States, who then came from the United States to Cuba to start businesses. And you also, particularly into the 20s and the 30s, had a big influx of Jews from what was mostly Poland and Lithuania. So as it applies to Miriam's family, they came from Eastern Europe. Her father's family, the Bradmans, her grandfather came in 1927 to avoid draft into the Polish army, because a little known fact, the Poles and the Czechoslovaks were fighting a war over the border. And what's interesting is that one of my uncles, or my great uncles, I have this photograph of him who I'm named after. He was in a uniform, and I learned a couple of years ago that that's why he was in that uniform. He was fighting that war. So her father went from Poland to Cuba to avoid that same war. And her mother's family came later, in around 1937. So why Cuba? Because there was a change in the American immigration laws that was instituted in January 1, 1924. The laws changed. There was no more open immigration. And this was as a result of a nativist movement in the United States that wanted to prevent immigration, particularly from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. They wanted to try to maintain the proportional relationship in the American white population of people from Northern Europe as opposed to Eastern and Southern Europe. So they changed the law. It went into effect on January 1, 1924. My grandfather was actually on the last boat that came in 1923. And there were many people in Eastern Europe, particularly Jews, who could no longer just get on a boat and make this move. What's interesting about it is you remember there were quotas. And the quotas weren't separate for Jews. If you were Jewish and you lived in Hungary, you went under the Hungarian quota. You Polish, you went under the Polish quota. So there was not this opportunity anymore. But the arrangement for people coming from Latin America was different. There weren't millions of people coming from Latin America. Basically, to oversimplify a little bit, if you went to Cuba or Mexico or any of these various countries and you stayed for a few years, anywhere from 2 to 5 years, if you became a citizen, you could enter the United States for immigration purposes basically legally. They did not have quotas from South America. So a good number of Jews who might have come to the United States went instead to Cuba. And many then came to the United States, but many also stayed. So among them were Miriam's mother's and her mother's family and her father's family. What's unique in this experience is that the Cuban Jewish community never suffered from any real anti-Semitism. The Cubans did not refer to them as, we'll get a little complicated here, in Spanish. Okay, so the word judío in Spanish is very derogatory. They're more likely, when referring to someone who is Jewish, as hebreo than judío, because judío is attached to the Jewish experience during the Inquisition. So instead, hebreo. They never referred, and more than one Cuban Jew told me this, they did not refer to the Jews as judíos or hebreos. They referred to them as torcos, coming from Turkey, or polacos, coming from Poland. There was not this standing situation that existed in so many other places. So the Jewish community grew, and they established themselves over the 30s and the 40s. And by the 1950s, they were a prosperous community. They were primarily entrepreneurial. They owned businesses, and they were at that cusp of that generational change where their children were now likely to go to university and to study and become professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, whatever, as opposed to just being business people. In the case of Miriam's family, the Bradmans owned leather tanning factories and shoe manufacturing factories. The Resnicks owned the term in Spanish is colmado, or at least in Dominican Spanish, it's colmado, which is sort of like a general store, but they also sell, sort of fresh groceries. And they lived in a place called Regla, which is a little island community that's in Havana Bay. So the Jews had become prosperous. The Jewish community had become prosperous. By the 1950s, they had 3 synagogues. They had a private Jewish beach club. They had a Jewish country club. They were sending their children to universities. They lived the way any middle class or upper middle class Cuban would. They had a nice sized house full of servants. By the way, we'll talk about this later. There was a day after the revolution where the servants simply stopped showing up. So they were very prosperous. And, I had an event last month at a synagogue out in Long Island, and 2 women who were Cuban Jews, they showed up and they were telling, the way those women said, whatever you had in the United States, we had in Cuba. You had TV, we had TV. You had nice dresses, we had nice dresses. You had cars, we had cars. Our lives were not terribly different than yours, except for the fact that they spoke Spanish and American Jews speak English. So in a lot of ways, and when I looked at photographs that the Bradmans showed me of their families in that time period, that's what I saw. I saw them wearing the same clothing my parents wore at that time. They came from that same era, as I said. And, so it was a little bit of a shock when things started to unravel. So, quickly, and, we can have some questions later and you can ask me more about this. How did things unravel? So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the Bradmans. And we should also understand that there were Jews within the community, which was about 15,000 strong in 1958. There were many Jews who supported the revolution and supported Castro. It's also important to understand that there was a serious anyone but Batista movement. Fulgencio Batista was a fascist and he was a dictator. He was not a nice guy. He was originally elected for 2 terms in the 1930s. After he was not permitted to be elected again, he was the kingmaker. I think in 1953, there was an election where he forced himself into the election. The election was disputed, and he created a coup and took over the country. And from that point on, he was the recognized dictator of Cuba. This was not a nice guy. I once asked Juan Bradman, how many people have read the book? Oh, look at that. Now I feel so good now. So those of you who read the book, Juan Bradman is Aaron. Solomon Bradman, his brother, is Moses. And yeah, there's a reason I chose those 2 names, and someone can ask me about that later. So I said to him, Juan, what was it like with Batista? So he said to me, and I should say this, and it's no way derogatory, he sounded like Ricky Ricardo. So it was charming to talk to this guy always. And he was a very charming guy. And, I'm going to mention something at this point because I don't want to forget to mention this later. So I wrote another book called The Interpreter, and that's based on the life of my cousin's father, my cousin is sitting here. Okay. And my cousin's father, his name was Kurt, and he has the same name in the book. When I interviewed him, he said the same thing to me that Juan Bradman said to me, which is, he said, you can take things from my life and use it in a story, in a novel, but don't write a book about me because there's nothing unique or special about me. And I'm thinking, what are you kidding? In the case of Kurt, escaped the Nazis. In the case of Juan, escaped Castro. Yeah. So these guys were very humble. And so I said to him, what was the situation like? He said, well, he worked for the National Bank of Cuba, and he was an attorney for the National Bank of Cuba. And he said, I could be leaving to go home for lunch and siesta, and I could come walking out of the bank, and I'd be on the street, and there could be 2 cars at one end of the street and 2 at the other, and they would suddenly, come careening down the street, and there'd be a guy standing there, and other guys would jump out of the car with submachine guns and just kill the guy. And I was just supposed to walk home. That was life under Batista. So this was a very bad guy. He was very corrupt. He brought the mafia in full force to Cuba. He gave them the opportunity to run all the casinos. He was a very bad guy. So people felt anyone but Batista. Alternatively, I said to Juan, how was it? How did you feel that day when Fulgencio fled, or Batista fled, and, Castro's forces entered Havana? And he said, we were jubilant. We were kissing each other and laughing and crying and singing and dancing in the streets. He said, but 2 weeks later, we knew we had made a tremendous mistake. So specifically, in this case, the real people, Juan and Solomon. Juan was educated as an attorney at the University of Havana, and his brother, also a student at the University of Havana, before the university was closed by Batista for some number of years, and also Paula Bradman also attended that university before it was closed. Solomon was an avowed communist. This was his political belief. This was a problem within the family, but it wasn't the big problem. So he became involved with the 26th of July movement, which was Castro's movement. And it's not that Juan was opposed to it, because the truth is that at that time, A, as I said, it was anyone but Batista, but B, Not everyone that was involved with Castro was a communist, although many of the guys who were, Che Guevara being one, were avowed communists. They came from clearly an entrepreneurial bourgeois family. And the father, whose name was Raphael, he kept funding Solomon's education. Interestingly, and I'll be honest in front of this audience, the bigger problem was that Solomon fell in love with a Cuban woman who was not Jewish. So when he married this woman, after he was told to get out of the relationship, after he married her secretly and then they found out about it, they disowned him. And that was prior to the revolution. So what's interesting here is that this issue of intermarriage, which we know was a real issue in this country at that time among Jewish population and still is, was equally as much of an issue there. It was a bigger issue for the parents of Juan and Solomon Bradman than the fact that Solomon Bradman was A, a communist, and B, a revolutionary. The part of the story that I have not been able to understand, and I've done a huge amount of research and I've interviewed nearly 30 people, Cuban Jews and non-Jews, refugees and the children of refugees. The part I don't understand is this. If it's me and I own a factory and there's a revolution and my kid is in the revolution, I think I'm going to have a conversation with him. They never, ever reached out to him. So with that said, because I don't want too many spoilers, okay? And I think I'm going to open it up to some of your questions, but, I'll let you know when there's a spoiler coming. What ultimately happened was that a couple of years later, Juan and his wife, Paula, tried to leave the country. So let me talk very briefly before we go to questions about what's real and what's Memorex and historical fiction. So why is historical fiction important? History, to begin with, is important. And the sooner we learn that lesson and the truth about history and that owning your history is like incredibly, incredibly important, all right, the better off we will be. Cannot rewrite history. It is what it is. And if we own it and we understand it, we won't try to make the same mistake in the future. Why I believe historical fiction is important to readers is that it's the closest we can come to time travel. That when I write this book, if I've done this correctly, I'm going to put you in the head of the character. If the character is terrified, you're terrified. If the character is happy, you're happy. I want you to feel what the character feels. And that brings you closer than just pages and pages of facts. It gives you the ability to feel what the character is feeling, especially if the character is based on someone who really lived. When I wrote The Interpreter, people said to me that they had to put the book down because the character is a German Jew or an Austrian Jew who comes back after the war to act as the translator in the interrogation of captured Nazis. People would say to me, how could this character have gotten through the interrogation? I said, I had to put the book down. I said, well, then I did my job. The same thing is true here. I want you to feel the paranoia that this character feels every time he has to think about what he can say to another person, because the truth about these systems is that half the population is spying on the other half of the population. Prior to the revolution, there was something called the Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities. Well, that ended with the revolution. But instead, we then had the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And these were in every apartment block. These were on every street in Cuba. There's someone watching you. I once saw a statistic that after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, there was someone looked at the Stasi files in East Germany, and 40% of the country was spying on the other 60% of the country. So we have to understand sort of, how this feels. That's what historical fiction can do that just a history book won't do. So sometimes, though, when we're writing, it's my job to keep you reading. I have to give you a full story. So everything is not necessarily real. Some things are made up. So in this case, the Cuban Revolution actually happened, but the incident at San Miguel itself never happened. So why do I need the incident at San Miguel to happen? Because I needed what's called in the writing business, an inciting incident. I needed something to catch the story, to start the story. Why did it need to be in this form? So for those of you who haven't read it, it's going to sound a little hazy. When there's a scene in the book, which is okay for you to know about, where the Aaron character and his wife Beatrice with their child Miriam are trying to leave the country. And it gets pretty hairy. And there's a question about the number of visas. Afterwards, they have to get a third visa. So when I was told this story by Juan Bradman and Paula Bradman, at the end of the telling, I said, do you believe that your brother tried, in any way, did he help you to get the visas? Juan clammed up, wouldn't say a word. Privately, Paula said to me, I believe he did. And Paula's sister, who had seen, she'd gone back to Cuba some years later, and she saw Solomon, she indicated that she believed the same thing. So now I know that this brother, who was rejected by the family because he married out, not because he was a communist, because he married out, okay? I know that he did something, or I suspect he did something to help his brother who wanted to leave the country. But there needed to be a quid pro quo, which is why I created the incident at San Miguel. Because after the incident at San Miguel, Juan has to do something to help Solomon, or Aaron has to do something to help Moisés. So I created that. Most of the other incidents referred to in the book, and you can ask, if you've read them, you can ask me about specific incidents. I will tell you whether or not they're real or Memorex. Most of them are I'll admit, very craftily adapted to, from what really happened to the book. So with that said, do I have a question? Please, someone has to have a question. No, I'm not leaving yet. Don't clap yet. We still have some time. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Hold on for the.
She's coming with the mic. Just give us a second.
Have you been to Cuba to do some of this research?
That's a great and embarrassing question. So the answer is no, I have not been to Cuba. Okay, so would it make sense that I would have gone to Cuba? Yes. Had I been able to go to Cuba, I absolutely would have been able to go to Cuba. But there was a certain guy who was in the White House a few years ago who made that impossible for me to happen. So how is it that I know so much about the Spanish Caribbean? So I kind of write at the intersection of Jewish and Latino. First of all, I live in Washington Heights, which is a heavily Dominican neighborhood. I spend a month every winter in the Dominican Republic. My best friend is Dominican, and he has a house there, and he spends the winters. He's a very smart guy. He's a master bicycle mechanic. He teaches other guys how to fix bikes. And since what he does is he works 7 days a week for 9 months a year. And then he takes off 3 months and goes to his house in the DR in the winter when no one's fixing bikes. So I go down there and I spend time with him. So over the last 15 years, I've gone every year except for the year of the pandemic. And I've learned about the Spanish Caribbean culture. So the first question that I had for people, and I discussed it with people who had visited both places, which is how different is the DR from Cuba? And the answer is not very in terms of the culture. It's the same, it's a very similar culture. So, and the thing to understand about these places is it's very, very different from the United States. And I wrote something in here about that. When I was interviewing Paula, the first time, I said to her, what was it like when you arrived in the United States? And she said to me, first of all, we arrived in New York in January. Okay, it's coming from Cuba to New York in January. And she said it was like a cemetery, that it was gray and white stone. And when they the left Cuba, when you're in the Caribbean, it's sensory. You are seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and feeling everything all the time. There's always music playing. You're always smelling garlic cooking. People are always shouting in the street. There's music playing all the time, not just, sometimes always music playing. When the rain comes by, you feel it on your skin, So it's an extremely sensory place. I knew that because I had spent so much time in the Spanish Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic. So I had an idea of what it looked like. And I would compare, I would talk to people who had experiences in both so that I understood that I was presenting the right picture. So what's interesting about that is there are differences, but it's usually like the name of something, what they call something. So for instance, the Dominicans eat something called mangu, which is mashed plantains, mashed green plantains, which are served with eggs and salami. It's delicious. It's the breakfast of champions. And in Cuba, it's called fufu. All right. And fufu is actually a word that's borrowed from West Africa, someplace in West Africa, in Nigeria. And when West Africans were enslaved and brought here, they brought that word with them, and what developed as mashed plantains, they took the name of what they used to eat for breakfast. But that's a whole nother book. So I tried to get this to be as authentic as I possibly. And then I had people read it who had visited Cuba, including Bradman's, and Paula said to me, absolutely nailed it. So I'm pretty confident that even though I haven't been there, it's representative of life, of what life was like there then, that you feel it. It's very important when you write that the reader has the ability to read the five senses. Another question. I hope I answered that okay. Right here. Thanks.
So in the book where Aaron and Beatrice's daughter Miriam eventually becomes very religious in the United States, was that based on the family, or just something that you created for literary purposes?
Great question. So this was one of the things that I found really, really interesting. So I'm going to first reference sort of Jewish life in Cuba in the 50s. There was, okay, well, first of all, how many kosher butchers were there in Cuba in Havana in 1958? Okay, there was either one or there was three. Depends on who you're talking to. Okay, so, but Miriam's family, the Bradmans, initially they lived all the way out in the mountains. And then later they moved closer to Havana. Instead of being 8 hours from Havana, they were 2 hours from Havana, living seaside in a small town outside of Havana. Cuban Jews were like American Jews in the respect that they observed as much as they could, but they were not particularly Orthodox. There were some who were, naturally, but the community at large, this was not a Hasidic community. This was a very broad, community in terms of observance. So, for instance, Paula said to me, as a kid, yeah, they ate pork. They observed the holidays. I know that Miriam's grandfather used to travel from this tiny town in the mountains. He used to travel for 8 hours, or stay overnight to get matzah once a year. Okay. When they came to the United States, it was in 1962, and then they moved to New York. And so in 1967, 68 was when Miriam was starting school. How many New Yorkers do I have here? Anybody remember the school strikes from 1967 to 1968? Okay. I remember the school strikes. There was a lot of problems. And he was very concerned, Juan was very concerned about the education of his daughters. So they couldn't afford real private school, which also would have involved going at the minimum to Brooklyn Heights with them every day. And they lived in Midwood, which is a rather long trip by subway. So he went to the highest, and the highest recommended a Solomon Schechter school near where they lived. Solomon Schechter, for I'm sure most of you know, is, I mean, it's not crazy orthodox, but it's people who observe Sabbath and keep kosher homes and don't drive on Saturday. They realized that if their daughters were going to have friendships and other children were going to come to their house, that they would have to become more observant. Juan wasn't even bar mitzvahed. They joined a synagogue. They sent the kids to Solomon Schechter. He studied Hebrew. He learned Hebrew prayer, and they started observing things. Were they strictly observant? No. But that's the basis for the assumption of more ritual and more observance in that household. And she still keeps a kosher home. Like, you know, I got to be careful what I bring in there when I go to visit, although she will let me bring a cake. If I bake a cake, she'll let me bring a cake, even though my kitchen is not kosher. So that's the story. Do I have another question?
A lot of people read the book. Do you want to do anything?
Oh, you
with
know what?
the
Yeah, why don't we? Okay,
epilogue?
so let me talk a little bit about that. You have a handout. So you have a couple of handouts. One of them is the alternate ending. So let me talk a little bit about the alternate ending. So when I write a book, what I do is, you know, I get a first draft out, and then I have what are called beta groups. One of the beta groups I have that reads the manuscript is a group of 5 writer friends of mine. And the reason I want them to read it is because, you know, I want people with sort of a literary bent, because remember, you can be a reader, you can be a writer, or you can be a writer who reads, and you're reading it differently than if you're just a reader. So I had these 2 possible endings, the ending that's in the book, and then there's another 2-page ending, which I handed out. So take a minute and look at the epilogue. Okay. And those of you who read the book can tell me whether or not you think that would have been the better ending. No, I have a no here. Okay. So it's really interesting that that's the Disney ending. Okay. That's the nice ending where everything gets wrapped up and people will, you know, they'll smile at the end and say, oh, how nice. The other ending is very literary. And every one of the writers said to me, this is the right ending. Do not change this. Now, the question is, where did it come from? So let me talk about that last scene in the book. So what you should know is that in real life, so there's no real contact between the 2 brothers for the last couple of years that they're in Cuba. From about middle of 1958, early middle of 1958, until the older brother Juan leaves in 1962, they have no contact. Both brothers claimed to have been sending letters after our own character leaves. No letters arrive. The assumption is that the Cuban government was censoring the mail because Solomon was a government official. So he really could not have contact outside the country, especially in the United States. In 1975, and this happened, he goes to Mexico on some sort of an economic mission, and he sends a letter, which they receive, postmarked Mexico City. In the letter, all it says is, I have a son. He has diabetes. Please send money and medicine. That opens a door, and Juan Bradman, our own, he gets in contact with groups in Canada who help to facilitate communication between people in Cuba and people in the United States. And that's when they sort of reestablish some sort of level of communication. Over the years, the level of communication increases because at some point you can make a phone call, but the phone calls and everyone I spoke to said the same thing. The phone calls were ridiculous. The phone calls amounted to, because someone's listening. The phone calls amounted to, oh, how's the weather? Oh, it's cold because it's January. Oh, well, the palm trees are beautiful here and it's very warm and breezy. So this is not communication. But this is what was basically permitted by the government, and you had to be careful. I mean, years later, when Miriam established contact through email with her cousin Eduardo, they had to be very, very careful about what they said in these emails. There's just no way that you could really talk. So when it was 2001, because that's when 9/11 happened. Finally, 40 years later, it's possible for Solomon to come to the United States, and he gets his own government's approval, and our government permits him to come, and they come for a month just before 9/11. And basically that scene at the end of the book, which happens on 9/11, is pretty much true except for the fisticuffs. I had to throw something in there to keep the reader happy. So the question is, did they ever really resolve it? So they don't really resolve it. So why the last line? And they never spoke about it again. Okay. So as I mentioned, my first novel was titled Forgiving Maximo Rothman, is based on the experience of my uncle Max Grunfeld, who escaped from Europe and went to Sosua. Sosua, for anybody familiar with Sosua? Okay, because you were born there. Okay. Sosua is a settlement on the north coast of the Dominican Republic. In 1938, there was something called the Avion Conference, which was called by President Roosevelt to talk about the refugee problem, the Jewish refugee problem. And the only country in the world that offered any substantive solution to accept a large number of refugees was the Dominican Republic. Trujillo, himself a fascist and a murderer and a rapist, he agreed to take up to 100,000 Jews and 10,000 the first year. Only 854 Jews went because the Jewish leadership internationally was against the plan. They didn't want Jews going anywhere but Palestine. They were trying to force the British to open the doors. So I tell you this because years later, my uncle went there with my aunt. They came to the United States in 1950. My mother was 15 years old. And my mother told me that when Uncle Max came, they went into, after dinner one night, my uncle and my grandfather went into a room and closed the door, and they were in there for hours. And my uncle told my grandfather everything that had happened, both in Europe and to them in the DR. And then she said to me, and after that, they never spoke about it again. So that's where that line comes from. So why that's really important, what you should understand about writers, is that we pull stuff from everywhere and we use it. And that was the appropriate thing to use in that spot. So with that, I guess I should say a couple of closing remarks. Oh, we have another question? Sure. Great question.
Jewish community now compared
Okay. Within a few years, say by the 68 or 69, 90% of the Jews in Cuba had left. Most of them went to Florida. A bunch went to Jersey. Go figure. Thank you, Hyas. Okay. So, Miami, Bayonne, I know where I'm going. So, today you have it depends on which Cuban Jew you talk to. The estimate is around currently 900. There was a big outflow in the late 90s because the Jewish Agency arranged for the exit, the aliyah of about 1,500 younger Cuban Jews. And even though many of them, including Miriam's cousin, were not, maternally Jewish, they were converted and brought to Israel. So today you have a very elderly population and a few of these stragglers who are people who were communists and their families stayed, and they may or may not be 100% Jewish. They still have a Jewish identity, and they can number I think it's around 900 from, sort of sampling. Some people say 300, some people as much as 1,200. So this is about 900. Do they live a Jewish life? Jews from here make it a point to bring things to them when they visit on these religious missions, these Jewish missions. So they bring matzahs and they bring taluses and prayer books. Okay. I don't know how much that makes a difference. Jewish identity, we all know this. It's a weird thing. It's got to be very, very deep. You know, a few years ago, I was in the DR and I went with my wife, and we were going to a place called Samana, which is really gorgeous. It's at the ass end of the island. I mean, it's just all the way out. It's one of the most beautiful spots ever. And we flew into Puerto Plata, which is next to Sosúa. So I had the occasion to meet with some of the, you know, descendants of the original settlers. So today you have maybe someplace between 70 and 90 people who live in Sosúa who were descended from these original settlers who intermarried with local Dominicans. The Chabad in the capital doesn't consider them Jewish, but they have a community that's ministered to by some Canadian Jews who retired to Puerto Plata. They have a synagogue, and they're very, very proud of who they are. It's the same thing in Cuba, who remains there. So, for instance, Miriam has one cousin who's still there, and she's the daughter of her uncle by his first wife. So that character, by the way, really existed. Anna Teresa existed. Her real name was Maria Elena, and I couldn't use the name because she's still alive. And she, the big communist, she left Solomon, and she said, I don't want to be a wife and I don't want to be a mother because the revolution is my child. And then she ran off with some other communist guy, and eventually he became the Cuban ambassador to Spain. So they were living the high life in Spain. You know, they weren't suffering in Cuba under the special period when people were eating, you know, plastic in place of cheese. By the way, for those of you who read the book or who do read the book, there is something towards the end where an American couple comes for a visit, and the real Solomon didn't guide these people around, but the incident actually happened. The people who went, from whom I got the story, was a friend of my wife. She and her husband, who owned an art gallery in Santa Fe, that actually happened to them. So there's a lot of real stuff in there. And that's really the story. I mean, I think the sad part of this is that in another 20 years, Cuba Jewry is a footnote in Jewish history, the way that Sosúa is a footnote in Jewish history. And that's a little sad, but, you know, I think the important thing to understand is that Cuban Jewry became a victim of its own success. That they were so successful as a community that when the communists took over, they didn't have a finger pointed at them because they were Jews. They had a finger pointed at them because they were entrepreneurs and they were of the bourgeois class. And ultimately, they were treated the same way as the rest of the population. And their, what they had built was taken from them, and they felt they had to leave. Some stayed. This couple, these two brothers were not the first that I've known of who've been in this situation. Do I have any other questions before we wrap up? I have some closing remarks.
One more question.
I was in Cuba 2000 and visited in Havana the Orthodox synagogue and went for a chicken dinner with a lot of other people at the non-Orthodox synagogue. Do you know if those still exist?
The only synagogue that's operating right now is the Patronato, which is probably the less Orthodox synagogue. It's difficult, and we all know this. It's difficult to be a Jew alone. You need to live in a community to be a Jew. I mean, we need 10 people to pray. So there's really no community left, and those who are left are very old. And it's an interesting point that a number of people made to me was that those who didn't leave often didn't leave because they had elderly parents or other relatives and didn't want to leave them alone. So they stayed. So before we sum up, I'm going to make a little bit of a pitch. So how can you help me? First of all, thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to see you all, and I hope you enjoy my book. So with that said, I hope you read all my other books, because that's how you help me. Okay? You buy my book, you read my book, you write a great review on Amazon, which I need you all to do immediately, because I got to get to 50 reviews. It's really important. I'm at 47. So if 3 of you would volunteer right now, I'd really appreciate it. Okay? But never, ever lend my book to anyone, because if you lend it, I don't get a royalty. So if you have, or a couple of just pieces of information, if you belong to a book club or you know somebody who belongs to a book club, not from here, or it could be from here. If you have a small group book club and you would like to read the book, I'm happy to meet with you on Zoom after you read the book. You know of other organizations who want to do something virtual or in person, let me know. I'm always happy to come to Southern California. Okay. It's not like someone's asking me to go to Michigan in the winter. So anytime. So with that said, I want to thank everyone, in particular the committee. Oh, Lise, what? Oh, of course. Thank you for reminding me. So right now I'm working on a couple of things, but the next book is called Fielder's Choice. I've written, 2.5 books about the Holocaust and 1 book about communism, and I've had enough. I can't take the tragedy anymore. So this is a book about Dominican baseball. So I know everyone loves baseball, so just invite me back in about 2 years. And the other thing I'm working on is it's kind of an interesting project, but it's going to take a little longer. It's an adaptation of the basic plot of Les Miserables, and I'm taking it out of Paris in the early 1800s, and I'm moving it to Broward County, Florida, in the early 2000s, and it's set in an old age where the two characters, the fugitive and the cop, end up in the same old age home. Okay, so it could be fun. And I'm going to turn it back over to Denise. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you. We've learned so much. For those of you on Zoom, before I forget, the community guide and the alternate ending is available. Just send Rebecca a note at the Federation. She'll send you a copy. So obviously, Alan's book will be available and he'll be in the back to sign it. Also, before we end, please enjoy that beautiful dessert reception and all the Cuban pastries. Finally, our next and last program is Saturday, December 2nd at Pasadena Jewish Temple at 7:30 p.m. The book is Muppets in Moscow. And the award-winning filmmaker and producer, Natasha Lance Rogoff, is going to discuss her book and her experience in Russia bringing the TV show. Thank you all for supporting the Federation and the Book Festival.